But yeah, we'll start in a minute. All right, thank you.
Who let Roy Flager in here? Somebody do something about this. This guy named Roy Flager.
Don't worry.
I see him on the attendee list and it's very suspect.
Well, welcome everyone. We're going to give a just a few more minutes for people to join in, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we can get started now. All right, everybody. Thank you for coming, and welcome to our class on how attorneys can expand their existing businesses through the use of 1031 exchanges and knowledge of the Delaware Statutory Trust as well. We're joined by, obviously, me, Zachary Kramer from Riverside 1031, our managing director of Riverside 1031, Len Berkowitz, our friends over at Fortitude Investment Group, the co-founders, Jeffrey Kiesnoski, as well as Daniel Raupp. And last but not least is the vice managing partner for the Falcon Rappaport Berkman PLLC firm, Matthew Rappaport Esq, LL.M.
Bad guy.
Which is full title. So, but at the same time, I'd say that he is by far one of the greatest 1031 experts I have ever worked with, and really is just a phenomenal speaker, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to get out of this class. And Matthew, if you'd like to take it from here, we can certainly get started. Obviously, if you need anything else from us, feel free to let us know.
Thank you, Zach. So this is normally the time when I slip $100 in your back pocket for saying nice things about me that aren't true, but I guess we'll have to skip that part. I'm hoping this finds everybody healthy and safe out there as this whole situation gets scarier and scarier, and that everybody's practicing the social distancing and doing all the stuff they need to do. and hopefully everything will go back to something resembling normal in short order. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in. Today's program is going to educate you about 1031 exchanges. We get pretty in-depth. Some of you may have seen me speak before. I've made some updates to the deck, so we're going to have some new topics in here. But generally speaking, it's going to be an across-the-board presentation from the fundamental all the way to the advanced. And we're not going to assume any certain level of knowledge for everybody. We're going to take it from the top because I think even for those of you who are experienced, this is going to be pretty informative. So again, I'm Matthew Rappaport. I'm Vice Managing Partner, Chair of the Taxation Group at FRB. We are a 28 attorney law firm that has offices in Manhattan and Long Island. And right now we're virtual. So my information's all the way there in the bottom right-hand corner, but it will be up again at the end of the presentation. And two things. One, actually, I'll make it three things. One, if you have any technical issues, you can go to the chat panel and you can talk to Zach about that. Our law firm is not the primary sponsor. That would be the lovely folks at Riverside 1031. So you can send a chat message to the panelists if you're having any technical problems. Don't contact my office. Second, if you have questions, use a Q&A panel. So there's a chat panel, there's a Q&A panel. Use a Q&A panel for questions. Use the chat panel to send messages and stuff. So get familiar with that module on Zoom so that you can use the proper channel to put forth your questions. Otherwise, there's a shot I might not see them timely. But I do encourage people to ask questions throughout the presentation. So, so get yourself familiar with all that stuff. And then third, if you would like to reach out to me and ask me any questions outside of this Zoom context, you can feel free to send me an email, but please limit it to email. The phone, we have VoIP, so if you call that number, you'll eventually be connected to me, but by far, strongest preference is email. So I just want to get that housekeeping out of the way. Last item of housekeeping, I promise. General disclaimer. Generally, what this says is, please do not take in this content and then sue me. But it's not legal or tax advice. Please don't rely on it. Don't market or promote anything that I put in here. Yeah, that's it for the disclaimer. At least one question has come in saying, Matthew, do you have video? No. The thing about it is that I am a Gorgon, and that if you see my face, you'll turn immediately to stone. So given that there's about 100 people on here, I don't want to do that to everybody. So I do not have any webcam turned on. So no need for you to think about whether you're missing out. As a matter of fact, I'm saving your life. So thank me later. So let me get into it first by covering the fundamentals. Right, a lot of you are familiar with what a 1031 exchange is, but I think it's worth saying that not everybody should do one. The vast majority of people should probably do one in the real estate industry, but there are some instances in which a 1031 exchange is not a great idea. So I'm going to cover the parameters of what this even is, and then I'm going to talk about when is this a good idea and the rare situations in which this is not a good idea. Okay, number one, a 1031 exchange is an accommodation under the tax code, right? It's not a loophole because it's written right in there. So 1031 exchange is written into the tax code, and what it says is, at least after the revisions for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which I'll talk about, what 1031 says is that you may exchange any real property for other real property of like kind without recognizing tax consequences. What does that mean in layman's terms? What that means is that if I'm selling any parcel of real estate that qualifies, we'll talk about what qualifies, but if I sell a qualifying piece of real estate, take that money, then go invest that money in other real estate that also qualifies, I don't owe taxes on my sale. Those taxes are deferred. They're not avoided. So what that means is the government doesn't tell you you can reinvest the money and then never pay taxes again. What they tell you is that you won't pay taxes right now. But for a lot of people who are in the real estate industry as lifers, what they do is they keep doing 1031 for as long as they live. And then when they die, they get what's known colloquially as the step up in basis. And that strategy is called defer and die, right? So if you do 1031 exchanges for your whole life, you'll never pay taxes on that particular sector of your portfolio during your lifetime. And then when you die, income tax basis is adjusted to fair market value of the date of death. What does that mean, right? For those of you who aren't familiar with what that means is that your income tax basis, or your reference point for determining how much tax you pay on sale, gets adjusted from what is presumably a pretty low value all the way up to the fair market value on the date of death. So if I've owned property my whole life, my tax basis will be quite low. At the time I die, if the property is worth $1,000, the basis gets stepped up to $1,000. And my heirs who inherit the property have two choices. If they sell right away or almost right away, then they sell without incurring any income tax. That's pretty cool. What's also cool is that if they decide to take the property and operate it, they get to start depreciation all over again, which is also really cool. So 1031 and the step up in basis kind of go hand in hand for people who have been in real estate their whole lives. And the only obstacle to that strategy really is the estate tax. To the extent that you are above either the federal or the New York State exemption or both, you would have to deal with the estate tax along with that step up in basis, but that's really outside the scope of this presentation. So to summarize here, 1031 allows you to defer taxes on the sale of real estate. What's the real motivator? It's at that circular bullet point at the bottom. Real estate owners can reinvest their property pre-tax rather than post-tax, right? So if I have $1,000 worth of real estate and I sell it, I'd rather buy $1,000 worth of real estate than pay my capital gains taxes. And I'm just assuming an all cash sale with no mortgage. You're going to end up if you're in New York City, you're going to end up with about $670 or so of after-tax money. And I'd rather reinvest $1,000 and make the income on $1,000 than I would reinvest $670 as long as I like real estate. And that's where we get into the rare instance where somebody might not want to do a 1031. And that instance is somebody doesn't like real estate as an asset class and they're motivated only by tax. A couple times now, I've had conversations with clients and prospects and things along those lines. And in a couple of instances, we've moved all the way down the line of doing a 1031 and then somebody turns around and says, oh, but what do you mean I'm stuck with this real estate? Or to tie it in with the very bottom bullet point I have here, if you partially reinvest your property into a different, you partially invest your proceeds into different real property and you take the rest as cash, the cash is what is known as boot. And boot is pretty much anything in a 1031 that does not qualify for the like-kind exchange rules, meaning if you take cash, if you take a promissory note, if you take anything that's not real estate back from the sale of your old property, you are taxed on that as boot. So some people have partially reinvested, partially taken boot and paid taxes, and then sat there and said, well, you know, I only deferred $150,000 worth of tax and now I'm stuck with this real estate. And I say, yes, isn't that what you wanted? And they say, actually not. And that taught me from the very, very beginning to go through with people extremely carefully what the projections look like, because the misconception out there is that this is a great tax play for everybody. It's not a great tax play for everybody, because if you don't like real estate as an asset class, then you're invested in real estate and you're illiquid and you have to wait for the income to be generated in order to have access to any liquid capital. So you don't want to do this if you don't like real estate as an asset class. You do this because you love the idea of reinvesting in real estate. So, so that's the broad overview of 1031 in a nutshell, right? What the Trump tax cuts did, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of December of 2017, it restricted 1031 actually only to be used in real estate. A lot of you who are attending may have previously thought that real estate was the only permissible asset class under 1031. That's actually not true. 1031 was available for any asset that met the qualified use requirement, which I have on this here slide, right? And I'm going to go over this in pretty good detail. But you would have any property that met the qualified use requirement would be eligible, but for the exceptions in the statute, which at the time it was written were stocks, bonds, partnership interests, and other securities, trust interests, other than Delaware Statutory Trusts, which do not count, and we will get into that later in the presentation. But interests in a regular estate planning trust, a beneficial interest, could not be exchanged for another beneficial interest. And choses in action, or the right to recover in a lawsuit, you could theoretically do an exchange of a right to recover in one lawsuit for another, but that would not qualify for 1031, even under the old rules. Now, everything is limited to real estate. You can only do 1031 with real estate. I will talk about the implications of that on the next slide. But let me first talk about the qualified use requirement because it's very important, okay? The qualified use requirement is twofold. One, you could either hold your property for productive use in a trade or business, or you could hold it for investment. What do these two things mean, okay? Productive use in a trade or business means that the real property is being used to house an operating business, basically. It's being used as a base of operations. So if I have a widget factory and I own the building and the land on which the factory sits, I'm not in the real estate business, I'm in the widget business. But the widget business is inside of the factory. If I sell that factory is 1031 eligible. What is the deal with productive use, right? In other words, why do I even use that phrase? If it's used in a trade or business, it should just be eligible, right? Not quite, because I'll tell you why. If you are in the trade or business of developing and selling condo or co-op units as a sponsor, those units are used in a trade or business, but they are used as inventory. And inventory is not eligible for 1031. It does not meet the qualified use requirement, and it is taxed at ordinary rates rather than capital rates. So you have to be careful with that stuff. It's got to, if it's used in a trade or business, it's got to be productive use. Or besides the productive use requirement, you can hold it for investment. Holding it for investment in the real property world means two things. One of two different things anyway. It's held for rental, the production of rental income, or two, it is held for the increase in speculative value. So those are really the only uses of real estate that will qualify you for 1031. We will get into some nuances later in the presentation, like what if I have a multi-unit building, part of it I live in and part of it I rent out? We'll talk about that. Personal residences and vacation homes are not eligible, but there is a way to convert them. We'll talk about that too. What we'll also talk about is we'll talk about those scenarios in which property is changing use. Maybe it was held for development and people were going to develop it, but then they abandoned their plans to develop. We'll talk about that too. So there's some nuances to this, but for you have to have qualified use in order to have a 1031 be a viable option. Again, no personal residences and no inventory, meaning that if you did a condo, co-op, residential subdivision, and you started selling off all the units to end customers, that is inventory. It does not meet the qualified use requirement, and you can't do a 1031 with it. What's the implication of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act saying real property only? Generally, if you have a personal property component, it means that you're going to have to do some planning with your client's CPA. So in a nutshell, if any of your clients have done a cost segregation or otherwise did separate depreciation for personal property, you got to talk to your client's CPA and you got to figure out how much is eligible and how much is not. Two things on this. One, if you don't know what a cost segregation study is, I don't know if we have the time to go deeply into it, but a cost segregation study is where an engineer looks at real property and breaks it down into its component parts. So it might break down a building into the shell, the HVAC system, the roof, the electric, the flooring, the carpeting, etc. And each of those components will have a faster depreciation schedule than the shell. The shell is usually 39 years. For multifamily property, it's 27.5 years. But if you do a cost segregation, then you can take certain elements and you can depreciate them faster. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as a matter of fact, you can depreciate them under the bonus depreciation regime, which might allow you to take a total write-off in year one. Pretty cool, right? Yes, until you start selling the property, and then you go for a 1031, and the part of the building that you broke down into its component parts, the shell is eligible, and there's some other parts of the building that are eligible even after a cost seg, but the rest of the personal property is not eligible, and you have to be careful about that. So the takeaway is this. If a client's doing a 1031, it's always a good idea to confer with the client's CPA beforehand anyway, but this is going to be an important reason why, and that just came into being after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Second thing I'm going to say on this is that the IRS sent their regulations under 1031 to the Office of Management and Budget 2 days ago. So the new regulations will be out talking about issues like this, where you have part real property, part personal property that's inside of the real property. The IRS will release those regulations within 30 days, and then this slide might become obsolete. So you got to be careful about that too. But as of right now, this is the way the law works on it. So what's like kind anyway, right? So we know, number one, your relinquished and your replacement property, right? The relinquished property being the property you sell, and the replacement property being the property you're going to buy in this 1031, right? They got to be like kind to each other. In real estate, it's a very, very broad universe, and I will talk about that and then turn it over to our friends at Fortitude to explain Delaware Statutory Trust. But one thing you need to know before we dive into the list: real property in the U.S. is not considered like kind to real property outside the U.S. What does that mean? What that means is that if you sell property in the U.S. and do a 1031, you got to buy other property within the U.S. Weirdly, Puerto Rico is not considered the U.S. for 1031 purposes. I don't even know why that is, but that is totally the way it is from a technical standpoint. Puerto Rico has opportunity zones all over it. We'll talk about OZs if we have time today. But if you're going to do a 1031, it's got to be U.S. to U.S. and really continental U.S. along with Alaska and Hawaii. On the other hand, if you do a 1031 exchange with foreign property, you're going to go foreign to foreign. You can't bring the property back into, you can't bring the proceeds rather back into the United States. I don't know why they do that, by the way. I don't know why they have that rule, but the rule exists. The reason why foreign 1031s are so rare is because 1031 is an exemption from U.S. tax, not from foreign tax. So any foreign tax that you would have had to pay is otherwise due. And since you don't have the liquidity because you're doing a 1031 to pay those foreign taxes, you got to pay them out of your pocket, and that is usually not ideal. So foreign 1031s are rare, but they do happen. Going to the list of like-kind property, right? It's pretty broad here. You can exchange anything on this list for any other type of property on this list. So you can exchange brick and mortar real estate for undeveloped land. You could trade into improved land, graded land, things like that. Long-term leasehold interest. This is pretty important, right? When you have a ground lease, the ground lease has to have 30 or more years remaining, including the term of any options, in order for you to be able to exchange into it. You're exchanging, by the way, into the tenant position on a ground lease. You can exchange into a landlord position on a ground lease as long as you buy the land. Once or twice, I've been asked, can I exchange into a landlord position on a long-term lease? No. Whether that's a landlord position on a ground lease without ownership of the land, or whether it is a long-term lease of brick and mortar space that is not land, you can't exchange into the landlord position on that lease. And the reason why is because those landlord positions and leases are considered income interests. They are not considered to be real property. So, so you have to be able to exchange in and also own the underlying real property associated with it. You can't just exchange into a landlord position without the corresponding ownership. Air and water rights, you can exchange into and out of them as long as they're perpetual. This is pretty big because of FAR in the city. More often than not, I have people who either want to purchase development rights or sell development rights that you can 1031 into and out of them as long as they're perpetual, which they usually are. Water rights or riparian rights, those are not a big deal in New York City, but outside of New York City, whether it's the Hudson Valley or it's Pennsylvania or Southern New Jersey, water rights all of a sudden start becoming a big deal. If you exchange into water rights, they have to be totally perpetual. Temporary water rights don't count. So you have to keep that in mind as well. You can exchange into and out of shares in a co-op, even though for state law purposes, shares in a co-op are personalty. There's a revenue ruling that calls co-op shares real property for 1031 purposes, but keep in mind you have to meet qualified use, and most co-ops are very unfriendly about rentals. Condos, same thing. As long as you meet qualified use, you're renting it out, or you're holding it for speculation, living in it. Condos are good as well. At the bottom of this list, they're bringing in our friends Stan and Jeff from Fortitude, Delaware Statutory Trusts and TIC funds, right? They're going to talk in detail about how these things are used, but there's really three broad uses of DSTs and TICs. The first one is that if you sell a $10 million property and you're buying at 8, and you have $2 million of boot you don't want to take, it's really easy to put that $2 million into a DST, because the DST has a highly customizable platform to put your level of investment wherever you want it, because you're buying a partial interest in property. And again, Dan and Jeff are going to go into great detail on this. Second, you are an owner who wants to retire, or you're an heir who gave it a shot at managing the property and you don't want to manage anymore. For anybody who doesn't want the trouble of actively managing real estate in the DST structure, a really experienced, really powerful institutional sponsor will do it for you. So that's really convenient. The third reason why you might want to consider a DST is because of backup identification. So if you have your eyes on one property and you're not sure if that property is going to close, no problem. You can identify DSTs as backup properties, and the DST can serve as your backup in case you lose the deal that you really want, but you don't want to pay taxes. So, so this is a good time to turn it over to Dan and Jeff, and then I don't know, Zach, if you want to shift the screen share or if I will be slide operator for Dan and Jeff. But we will turn it over to Fortitude for 20 to 25 minutes of information about what they do in the DST market, how they can help you and your clients when it comes to 1031 exchanges, and other information that you might want to know. Take it away, guys.
Oh, you guys are on mute.
Thanks, Matt.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Zach, for pointing that out. I wasn't sure if you were in control of the mute at that point or I was. Certainly appreciate everyone taking the time out to join us here. And thank you very much to my co-panelists, Zach at Riverside and Matt at FBR. I really appreciate the opportunity to get in front of all you and attempt to educate you on how we view the best use of Delaware Statutory Trusts. And for those of you who are familiar already with the DSTs, I apologize in advance for the rudimentary stages I'm going to take you through, because ultimately it's very important to understand them from a very high level before we get down into the weeds. I'm one of the co-founders of Fortitude Investment Group. I'm on the line here. Jeff Kiesnoski, my co-founder, my partner, is also on the line with us as well. And I've got a couple of different associates on the line enjoying the presentation as well. So thank you guys for taking the time also. If everyone on the call would take time after to visit our website, 1031dst.com, and register, create a username, log in, you get the opportunity to have an encyclopedia of information in reference to DSTs and 1031 exchange. Also, you can see a list of pre-existing and past Delaware Statutory Trusts that we have access to. Fortitude Investment Group, we are an independent branch office of a broker-dealer that sells securities. Very easy to understand, a Delaware Statutory Trust is an entity. It is a trust structure that holds deeded ownership to institutional quality real estate that qualifies for investors' 1031 exchange needs under Rev Proc 2004-86. They come in all shapes and sizes. So our firm, we attempt and do our best to make sure that the products that we are approving and reviewing are highly probable to work out the way that the multi-billion-dollar real estate firm that built the product is marketing it to. We want to make sure that our client's principal is protected. So we do our best to put multiple layers of due diligence into the investment before approving it and putting it on our menu. Ultimately, we are completely independent. We work with every large real estate company that build products called Delaware Statutory Trusts. And our job, again, is to review these products, decide whether they're likely to work out in that favorable manner for our investors. And once we feel confident, we put them on the menu of approved products and we include them in our potential allocation or allocation examples that we share with investors, provided that they are accredited investors. The qualification to invest in a DST is you have to have at least a $1 million net worth excluding your residence, and or make at least $200,000 per year for the previous 2 years plus expectations of making the equivalent during the year we're in. Again, going back to the Delaware Statutory Trust and the types of real estate that are in these trusts, they really come in all shapes and sizes. So they're multifamily, they're retail, they're storage facilities, there's hospitality, there's triple net lease. So there's something for everybody. And in our opinion, diversification is key in this environment. The different sponsors that we work with they're very, very important, a sponsor in a Delaware Statutory Trust, because most of the DSTs, the way that a DST is structured is with a master lease. So if you have a 400 unit garden style apartment complex that's held in a Delaware Statutory Trust, your investor, he's selling his building, he has the proceeds, he uses his proceeds to invest in a DST. He's effectively purchasing a percentage interest of a trust structure that owns a building, and therefore he owns the same percentage of the building held in the trust by owning that percentage of the trust structure. If that building is a 400 unit garden style apartment complex, your client does not have 400 individual leases with all those individual tenants. He has one master lease with a sponsor that has the leases with each individual tenant. Therefore, the projections put in place by the sponsor are underwritten to work out, and they're trying to make sure that if they project to an investor that they're going to make 5% income year one, they don't want high fluctuations. If the building goes from 95% occupancy down to 90% occupancy, they don't want to be moving on a monthly basis the income going to the investors. So what they're doing is trying to give a conservative underwriting and expectation to investors that they can hopefully outperform. And then if they do outperform the 5%, let's say, they split each point above 5% with the investor, which is a little bit getting into the weeds, but important to understand that many of the sponsors sit on the same side of the table as the investor because they want to outperform the promises that they're trying to make. So one of the other major advantages or uses and tools that a Delaware Statutory Trust provides is the leverage component. Many DSTs have pre-existing non-recourse debt associated with them. And what that allows investors to do, that means a client sells for $1 million and they don't have any leverage. They did not pay off a mortgage on closing. If they take that $1 million and purchase a portfolio of 3 different DSTs that average 50% loan to value, they're purchasing $2 million worth of real estate because they get credit for $1 million of the equity and $1 million of non-recourse debt that doesn't show up on the client's credit. They don't have to be underwritten for it, but they get the tax advantages of that debt. So for that investor that didn't need the debt component, but he invested in a leveraged portfolio of DSTs regardless, he just traded up. He sold $1 million and now owns $2 million worth of real estate. And therefore, he increased his cost basis and now has further potential for tax shelter on the income he's receiving off of that DST investment. More commonly, investors sell paying off a mortgage at closing. So client sells for $5 million, but paid a $2.5 million mortgage off at the closing table. He doesn't have just $2.5 million to invest to meet the requirement to defer the entire taxable situation or tax liability. He has $5 million. He has to replace the sale price, the relinquished sale price, relinquished property sale price, which is the full $5 million. So if he takes that $2.5 million and purchases a 50% leveraged DST portfolio, he will have effectively accomplished his goal of a complete tax deferral. The flexibility that you have with the Delaware Statutory Trusts in helping legacy issues. So many of you will be dealing with families that in the future have 5 different legs of inheritance that they need to separate their assets among. We've been very, very successful at Fortitude in navigating some very complex exchanges with wealthy families that need to be able to pass their real estate. Many of these families, it was 2 generations of blue collar guys that built up tremendous wealth in real estate. And the 3rd generation has become attorneys, doctors, just their parents' income has afforded them a different lifestyle and different career path than being hands-on real estate owners. So their parents are attempting to set up passive solutions to pass to their beneficiaries without having the tax obligation of just selling and handing them cash. So they set up a diversified portfolio of DSTs, whereas in any one DST, we can separate that investment into as many units as we need to. So if we buy one particular property and a client wants to invest, hypothetically, let's say they have $10 million that they need to invest and they want to pass that to their 5 children in the future, but they want their children to be passive. They don't want them to be active real estate owners. They would simply buy 5 different investments in each DST that we would diversify them into. Therefore, when they do pass and the children get the step up in basis, it's very easy for us to retitle the DST ownership into the different names and categories. So there's many different ways to use the Delaware Statutory Trust in estate planning. There's also low minimums in Delaware Statutory Trusts. So as Matt pointed out, one of the common ways to use a DST is for boot issues. We can take as little as $100,000 into a DST, which brings me back to the diversification side. One of my favorite sayings is it's not going to be the things that you and I don't know that are going to hurt us. It's going to be the things that we are 100% positive about and then wind up being wrong. So we're all human. We fall in love with certain ideas, certain investments, certain sectors. And it's when you fell in love and you put all your eggs in that basket that you really wind up hurting yourself. So we really stress diversification, and the diversification that you can get within a Delaware Statutory Trust is not only geographical diversification, sector diversification, so different, multifamily, storage, hospitality, triple net lease real estate, all with, you sell $1 million property, there's no way you could get exposure outside of a DST to so many different types of real estate. But within the DST world, you can be an owner of all of those different classes of real estate. And then the 3rd diversification you get is sponsor diversification. Again, we work with every major institution that builds the DSTs, and our job is we hire 2 different 3rd-party companies to do due diligence on these investments before we approve them, and then do our own due diligence and allow them on our menu of approved products. Many times the DST product comes into use with investors that are in S Corp situations. So one of the examples that we come across is a client sells an investment with his brother, and they both wanted to kind of, inside of the S Corp, buy their own, because they had a handshake agreement. So they each want to buy their own building inside the S Corp. And that's great. And I'm sure that they'd be honorable to it, but it's the S Corp that is the entity that actually owns the real estate. And there's one exchange going there. So when you're dealing with identification rules, which Matt's going to walk everybody through, you only have one set of identification to go through. So if one of the brothers finds real estate that he wants to identify, and he goes ahead and starts to list those things, it's going to limit the other brother as to what he can buy. So we've wind up going through many different S Corps where they come to see that the best way for them to move forward on a 1031 exchange would be through Delaware Statutory Trusts, where we can help organize their future. And, both of them are getting a passive solution done, and they don't have to argue who got the better real estate, and if one of their real estate is not doing well and dragging the entire S corp down, it could cause a lot of issues. We also stress to investors, even ones that are hell-bent on finding their own real estate, we're in unprecedented times. More deals now than ever have fallen through. It is absolutely crucial to your clients to have a backup identification. So if you work with us, reach out to us, we will always help you identify a DST that we think will be around, that if your client uses a 3-property rule, let's say, he identifies 2 pieces that he wants to identify and wants to buy directly, we can give him the 3rd piece that if both of those deals fall through, he at least has a last fail-safe option that we can make sure we reserve for him that he'd be able to close on and remove the liability of paying those taxes. Basically, I think I've hit the majority of all those. Jeff, if there's something that I'm missing and you wanna kick in there. Zach, can I move on through the slides? Because I haven't seen the slides.
Matt, mind just knocking it through? Let's see here.
So Dan, I didn't know if you were going to cue me. So
that's my fault. I'm not used to the slides.
Yeah,
So
no, don't worry about it.
So Fortitude, we kind of hit on already. Again, we have offices in New York, Florida, New Jersey, California, Chicago, and Boston. Again, myself and Jeff Kiesnoski and our partner, John Paul Sorelli, own the company. And, we have a great team. We have a white glove service. So let me walk you through the process. Go to the next slide here. So this is the different offices. Okay, move to the next slide. Went through what a Delaware Statutory Trust is. Again, if you want to look it up, Revenue Ruling 2004-86. Real estate versus the Delaware Statutory Trust. We are not real estate brokers. We're not agents. These are sold as securities. They're Reg D private placements. So that, again, you have to be an accredited investor. And one of the advantages to a DST, in my opinion, is that they are so scrutinized. The sponsors have to list every potential risk, no matter how far-fetched it might be, inside the private placement memorandum. Whereas if we were just straight realtors, we might be motivated to paint over a leaky ceiling and hide it until we make the sale just to move on to our next deal. That kind of thing shouldn't happen inside a Delaware Statutory Trust. That it has to really lay out those disclosures. Does it happen? I'm sure it does, but it's less likely to when you really have to list every possible risk and potential risk, which I certainly appreciate on a passive type investment. Go ahead to the next slide. General guidelines of a Delaware Statutory Trust. So you've got an ample amount of investors. The old structure used to be a tenant in common structure where you had 35 investors going in really as partners. The debt on those deals was recourse. So I'm sure many of you have partners. It's hard enough having a couple partners, never mind 35 strangers that had to come to an agreement to refinance or sell a building during a bad time. The banks wound up taking a lot of losses and really hated that structure. So the new adopted structure that banks really prefer would be the Delaware Statutory Trust. Going into the simple and efficiency of the process, realistically, it's very, very easy for us to close on an investment. So clients that sell, hypothetically, if you sold today on April 23rd and you came into cash and that money went to Zach at Riverside, we'd be able to establish and close you on a DST portfolio probably within 5 days or sooner of getting all the money placed and you invested. Therefore, you'd receive your entire month of May income payable to you in June, which if you account that towards your year one cap rate compared to trying to buy something directly with real estate, it might take you 4, 5, 6 months to close on that. That's 5 months of income on a $10 million deal that you were going to see 5% on. That's a substantial amount of revenue out of you or your client's pockets. Again, we've hit on investors, cannot cause a default on the entire loan, where a tenant in common structure, you can have that happen. These are 100% passive investments. Clients that invest, they're taking the trust in the investment company, the real estate firm that built the DST, and they're allowing their track record, the DST sponsor, to speak for itself, and putting the trust in them that they're going to do the right thing and deliver the returns that they've projected to the investor. Most of these investments, most of these clients are going to be invested for anywhere from 5 to 10 years before the sponsor comes back to us and ultimately says, hey, great news. We're getting some wonderful offers on the property. Prepare your investors that are invested in ABC DST for another 1031 exchange, at which point they would establish their account again with their qualified intermediary. And if they want to, they can reinvest in DSTs that are available at that time. They can purchase a building at that time directly, just like their original exchange. Or they can pay the taxes, which usually doesn't make sense, but sometimes it really does make sense. And we're going to push clients towards that if that's really the right and suitable thing for them to do.
There's a couple other things I'd like to point out, Dan. If you already mentioned it, to just cut me off. So another benefit that the DSC brings to the table is that there are a lot of we actually do get institutional investors that developers that come in, and these are guys that generally want to have their own projects themselves, because DST allows up to 1,999 investors in a typical DST. We do custom DSTs with these large institutions where a single owner could control an entire DST by himself. And that comes across our table a lot. And so we can actually do custom DSTs for individual investors, creative financing as well. So that's all done by the institution, is non-recourse to the investors that are doing the exchange. I just wanted to point that out because that comes up a lot from referrals from clients that are doing larger exchanges.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the attendees had a question, and I want to just make sure that everyone understands it. So when you're doing a 1031 exchange, like kind in the real estate world, and I'm sure Matt's going to highlight on this a little bit more in his presentation, but real estate to real estate is way more flexible. So you can do raw land into a hotel. You can sell a multifamily and purchase raw land. That is still considered like kind for purposes of 1031 exchange. So the 400 unit garden style apartment complex, if you sold an individual vacation rental out in Montauk, Long Island, you can go ahead and purchase a percentage interest in a Delaware Statutory Trust that owns a CVS portfolio or Walgreens, and that would go ahead and be considered like kind for purposes of your client's 1031 exchange. I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, and you could also add cash to a DST. So if you had a 50% loan to value your client, and they want to go into an all cash DST, they certainly could inject funds into that DST, or they could actually just come out and straight up invest cash into a DST, and it gives them the ability. So when they do go full cycle, they can continue with 1031 exchange and kick the tax liability down the road until eventually when they pass and their beneficiaries get to step up in basis. If that answers the question.
So thank you, Jeff. So investors do not need any special purpose entities as well. So the DST acts as the entity or the structure protecting investors from some of the liability that most people build their corporate entity to provide them with. So Matt, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So again, we're dealing with very, very large institutions, Inland, Pasco, Blue Rock, Cantor Fitzgerald, NREA, just to name a few. So we're looking at many, many different buildings, many, many different deals. And a lot of these companies have phenomenal relationships. So they are buying, they're buying real estate either directly from a developer that they have a relationship with, a bank, a pension fund, whatever the case may be. They're able to purchase these buildings, not necessarily all the time, but they often are able to purchase these buildings without having to go to LoopNet or some sort of bidding war situation. So they get a favorable situation for investors. All of the fees and expenses are built into a Delaware Statutory Trust. So when a DST sponsor is marketing it that it's going to have a year one income stream, it's underwritten with all of the expenses, the marketing costs, the commissions that we are paid, so the clients do not pay us additional capital, all of the closing costs, the mortgage fees, all of that is baked into the program. So when a client invests $100 per $100,000, their 5% income stream is based off 100,000, not based off 100,000 minus the fees. The fees are already built in, so therefore it's almost as if the real estate has just been marked up with the expenses. The white glove approach that Fortitude takes, we help your office, we help the qualified intermediaries office, which Zach's done a bunch of closings with us, and Matt's done a bunch of different real estate transactions with us as well. And what we try to do is make sure that clients know that there's one quarterback, that there's not several different entities, the accountant, the attorney, the sponsor, everybody reaching out and being redundant with the types of questions or requests going at the client. It can make a client extremely frustrated. So we are very, very organized. We make sure that the client's paperwork is filled out, detailed, and correctly to make sure that their 1031 exchange is done correctly, because there's a tremendous amount of liability if it is not. Very important to us. It's monthly income. There is tax advantages to the income. And we can go to the next slide. So this kind of talks to the process. Ultimately the first initial conversation with any client is going to be discovery. We want to understand their total picture and what they're trying to accomplish. We are very solution based. We have access to all different types of products. So it's always worth a conversation. If you're even questioning if there is a solution, if it's out there, we've probably been exposed to it, and potentially with the amount of deals that we have done, we probably directly have dealt with a very similar situation. So if we don't know an answer, it's likely we know somebody like Matt who would certainly have the answer. Next slide. So again, this kind of just goes through again the process in which that we take our clients and from step one to a final position of them being invested. Now, they're going to receive monthly income. They receive a profit and loss statement year end that is very, very much like the P&L statement that they'd have their accountant or bookkeeper keep on their own real estate. And all of the same write-offs are available to them to put towards other real estate ownership that they have in their portfolio, because it is true deeded ownership inside that trust structure. So it is absolutely treated just like real estate. Next slide. So this talks about the suitability requirements. Again, it is for accredited investors. And we send out private placement memorandums with all of the risk disclosures and the details of every property. We help the clients pick out what the best available Delaware statutory trusts are in our opinion, and then we take into account what their opinion is as well. And next slide. Okay, so we're going to want to bring it right to you guys right after that into the vacation homes.
Yes, yes. But I wanted to mention, I really appreciate everything that you obviously went over the DSTs. But for all of our listeners right now, I want to go over the first code very quickly, which is the first code being the word great, spelled GREAT. Great.
Great.
Take it back to you, Jen, if you want to obviously finish up before we jump into the beauty of the
And-
vacation homes and everything else that goes into a 1031 exchange with these conversions and such.
Great,
A
great.
couple of questions. Did you get to answer all the questions that came up? I saw there was a few outstanding questions under the Q&A if you look at the below your screen.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
so we had, no, go ahead, Dan.
somebody said, what is a Fortitude DST expense commission at an investor? I did touch on that. Ultimately, the Fortitude DST expense commission is built into the deal. We do not charge the investor a separate fee on top of whatever we get paid and compensated from each sponsor. We are completely independent, so there's not a sponsor that pays us higher amounts to push product. We look at every single deal and try to diversify investors and make sure that we're selling suitable investments to them in a very consultative way, and really taking into account all of their different investment worlds, because we want to create efficiencies for high net worth real estate investors. We also handle 1033 exchanges for those of you who are potentially exposed to that. That's eminent domain and or condemnation, different rules, different webinar, but certainly something that a Delaware Statutory Trust offers a suitable replacement option many times. What are the other questions? Do you guys see any other questions that are?
I think you got them.
Yeah, I think, and obviously if anything else pops up between now and the end of the class, we can always get to it at the very end through the questions section.
Perfect. So in closing, again, if everyone would just log into 1031dst.com and create a username and log in. You can always email me directly at draupp@fortitudeinvestments.com and or give me a call anytime. So appreciate it. And you can take it away, guys.
Also, when you do sign up for the website, in one of the boxes, it's going to ask, referred. Just put Riverside exchange class. That's this way we know who we're allowing into the website. So I want to make note of that.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. All right, for those that weren't listening before, again, just to reiterate the code for this class, the very first one, great, GREAT, great. And now Matthew Rappaport, if you wouldn't mind taking it away, jumping into the beauty of what is a vacation home and how many times I get calls regarding properties that are just held a little bit too long for personal use right before they jump into a 1031 exchange. And feel free to take it away.
Zach, what is the plan for or your attitude toward a break? Are we doing one? Not doing one?
I suppose we certainly could do one. If you have certain questions you want to answer, or if you want to step away, grab some water.
Oh, it's 12:57 Eastern. What I think we should do is we should break until 1. So like everybody who needs to go take care of something quick, let's give them the opportunity to do it, and then we'll start right back up in 3 minutes from now. Pretty logical time to just take a breather. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone.
All right, cool. So we're gonna get back on 1 o'clock Eastern, and I'll take us home for an hour, doing the back end of this presentation, and and everybody can be nice and refreshed for the last leg of it. So let's do that.
Sure.
Thanks.
We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. For those currently listing questions in the Q&A section, we'll be starting to get to every single one of those at the very end of the Q&A section. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into the DST investments, as well as specific 1031 exchange questions such as vacation homes, and even though you may own the property and assume it may accumulate in value, it may not necessarily qualify it for a 1031 exchange outright. Obviously, I'm still here if you should ask any questions regarding 1031 exchanges. I will obviously will be able to answer them near the end as well. And feel free to let me know.
All right, Zach, I think I'm going to jump back in.
All right, feel free.
Cool. Okay, let me answer some of these questions here. Dan and Jeff, I don't know if I know Dan, I think, had to take a 1 o'clock phone call. Jeff, if you want to step in and talk about comp, there's a question here about comp to Fortitude on the DST side.
Right, Dan alluded to that a couple of minutes ago.
I gotcha. All right.
So
I'm actually going through each one of these questions now and responding before I jump on that other call. But Matt, thank you for pointing that out. Again, just to be clear, every DST, so each sponsor and depending on the type of real estate, have different carry costs and different expenses inside. Our fee is built into the fees that are inside the DST. I would say the majority is around 8% of the cost of buying the building is really the cost of setting up the DST. So 8% of the purchase price of the building. And that includes not only the marketing expenses, the mortgage, closing, legal fees, also includes a reserve. Many of the DSTs have a large amount of capital. They sit in a separate segregated account that if there is some unforeseen circumstance, maybe it's a deductible for an insurance payment because the building got hit with a hurricane. They cannot come back to investors and ask investors for a cash call and ask them to put more money in. So they have to have capital in a reserve account, which is a part of that 8%. And so I hope that helps to clarify a little bit. But the real bottom line is when we discuss these investments with investors, all of the returns and income are discussed net of all of the fees and expenses.
Yeah, I was about to ask that, Dan. Like everything's cash on cash when you put forth all the projections and the stuff like that, right? It's return on your total investment.
That is correct. And
Right.
I want to leave you with this because this might also help clarify. There are 3 ways that you can make money in DST investments. 1 is the cash flow, so that's your rental income. 2 is any amortization that is offered on the pay down of principal in the mortgage. So that equity increase is the investors. So when they sell it, that would be an additional upside that the clients see. And then the third, obviously, is any appreciation that is offered. The average rate of return that many of these sponsors market is anywhere from 8 to 10% total return, including cash flow, amortization, and appreciation. Total return, that's per year, annualized. Obviously, past performance is not indicative of future results and all the disclosures that come along with that. But that is one of the track record pieces that many of the sponsors share. So hopefully that clarifies some of the questions.
And Dan, also, it's monthly income, and it is passive income.
Yeah, that was the next one here. It's is it active or passive? It'll always be considered passive income. The taxpayer does not materially participate. So glad we got that one out of the way. All right, great. So this puts us in a good position to proceed here. So let me jump back in. I want to briefly go over vacation homes because, as Zach mentioned, the frequency of these questions is pretty high. Vacation homes do not qualify on their own for 1031. If you have a vacation home, it does not meet qualified use. However, there's a revenue procedure that says if you really want to safely convert your rental property, your vacation home to a rental property and then make it qualified use, you can follow this revenue procedure. Now, revenue procedures of this type set forth safe harbors, and what safe harbors are is that if you follow them to the letter, the IRS will not enforce, okay? So this revenue procedure, 2008-16, says that in the 2 12-month periods that are, again, if you want to sell your vacation home, right? In the 2 12-month periods immediately before the exchange, you rent to somebody else a fair market rental for 14 days or more, and you personally use the unit for the lesser of 14 days or 10% of the days that you actually rented out. Here's what it means in a nutshell. In 2 years, if you don't occupy the property at all and you rent it out to somebody for 2 weeks or more per year, the IRS will not enforce. That is clearly qualified use for 1031 purposes, and that's how you would convert a vacation home. If you're going to exchange into a home you'd like to use it for a vacation home, you would do the opposite. You'd rent it out for 2 years at 14 days or more and never occupy it, and then move into it after the 2-day period. The thing being, though, there's a lot of gray in between the revenue procedure, which is a total safe harbor where the IRS will not enforce, and a bad transaction. And those judgment calls are some that I assist with, because typically speaking, the CPAs are not in a position to make those judgment calls. So that's one of the places where I step in as tax attorney. Other stuff on residential property, right? I talked about the idea of, hey, Matthew, what happens if I have a multi-unit property in Queens or Brooklyn or Staten Island and I live in one unit and I rent out the other 1 unit or 2 units or 3 units? The answer is that your transaction gets bifurcated is the answer, right? So for those purposes, you will go ahead and take the portion of the purchase price that corresponds to the place you live. You'll be able to use Section 121, which is the exclusion for the sale of a primary personal residence. I put the details on the left side of this slide over here, but it's $250,000 of gain exclusion for a single person, $500,000 married filing joint. You got to use the property as your primary personal residence 2 out of the previous 5 years. But if you meet those requirements, you can get the Section 121 exclusion on the portion of your property that corresponds to your unit. The other units, you'll be able to send to Zach over at Riverside 1031, and you'll be able to use those in a 1031 exchange. So if I have a $4 million building with 4 units in it, each of the units is $1 million, I can use the Section 121 exclusion for my own unit and take the other 3 units purchase price, which is $3 million, wire it directly to Zach at closing, and then have Zach do a 1031 with the rest of the purchase price. You can use 121 and 1031 at the same time if you meet all the requirements. The same goes for converting a primary personal residence to a rental property. You can convert to a rental property, and you can still meet the 2 out of 5 requirements. So you can convert under the revenue procedure in the previous slide, and you can both exclude the first 250 or 500 grand of gain, and then take the rest of the money and use it on 1031. Just to be clear, For the example in which I have a $4 million property with 4 units, if the $1 million that's paid for my personal residence doesn't get covered all the way by the Section 121 exclusion, the rest of it's capital gain. The only thing that you could do about that is an opportunity zone, and if we have time, we'll cover it. This is the part where we're going to have some combination of Zach and Len step in here and talk about, one, what does a QI even do? And two, why would you use Riverside over another QI? So we'll get into that in a moment, but I'll set the stage by saying 1031 exchanges, right? You're exchanging one property for another. But how does it happen? What are the mechanics? That's what we're going to go into right now, okay? So the most common form of an exchange is a forward or delayed exchange. We'll cover the other forms after we're done with this one, but this is by far the most common one. How does this happen, right? We got the overview slide here, and then we got the detail slides later. The overview is basically the intermediary is the body under the tax code that is meant to step in and hold the properties, right? The actual ownership of the property is theoretically held by the QI for a portion of this transaction, even if it's just momentary most of the time. And the QI holds the money. And we will talk about the parameters around the QI holding the money and the property a little bit later. But the buyer here is the outside buyer. So if you or your client is executing a 1031, you're the exchanger at the top of this diagram. Even though the deed goes to the buyer, the qualified intermediary is the deemed owner for a brief moment, and the proceeds of sale go to the qualified intermediary to keep. The third party seller, right, that's on the right side of this diagram, gives the deed of the property to you, the exchanger or your client, but the sale proceeds come from the qualified intermediary with the money they're holding for you. There are two big time periods for you to keep in mind here, and they are not flexible except when there's a global pandemic or other type of disaster. 45-day identification period and 180-day exchange period. The ID period is after you make that sale, you have to identify candidate properties that you're going to buy within 45 days. 135 days later, which is 180 days after the exchange starts, you got to close on one or more of those identified properties. The thing is, as I mentioned later, these deadlines are inflexible, but we will talk about COVID-19 because I have some slides in here about COVID-19, right? So we talked about these two exchange periods. We talked about these time periods rather, so I'm going to skip that slide. Where I'm going to have Zach and Len formally step in here is what you do to get a 1031 exchange going. First thing you need to do is you got to contact the QI, because without a QI, you are not going to be able to execute a forward or delayed exchange. You must have a QI in order to do it. The QI industry is not regulated. So one of the reasons why you want to go to Riverside is because Riverside has internal controls and a surety bond and all sorts of other stuff. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Zach and Len to talk about Riverside and what they do and why you want to go with them when you're doing your next 1031 exchange.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
So yeah, so in general, when it comes to a 1031 exchange, we'll typically get a call from people saying that, oh, we heard about 1031 exchange, very last minute, we're closing very quickly, or, you know, it really varies depending upon the actual seller. I'd say most of the time, though, you get like a couple weeks notice, but even sometimes it's the day of the closing and they're just simply not aware that this option is available to them. And it's very important that they do give us a call prior to the completion of the closing, as the closing date is considered to be final once the burdens and benefits of the property have been transferred over to the new buyer. And there's nothing that can really be done once the closing has been completed. There's no backdating. You can't go retroactively do a 1031 exchange, because one of the most important parts of a 1031 is the fact that you, the seller of your relinquished property, are not in control or in possession of the sale proceeds from that property. If you are in any way given a check with your name on it as the seller of the property, and you take that check and either deposit it or put it and give it to your attorney at the end, the closing is basically considered to be completed at that point, the exchange cannot continue. However, if you call us the day before the closing, let's say as an example, and you tell the buyer of your property, hey, I'm doing a 1031 exchange, I do qualify, the contract allows for it, please cut the checks to the qualified intermediary instead of cutting it to me directly. At that point, you'll enter into what's known as an exchange agreement with the qualified intermediary, allowing us to take possession of these funds, following all the regulations set by the IRS regarding the actual withholding of these funds by the qualified intermediary, and then we essentially convey this property that you're actually selling to the buyer, and the buyer then conveys the funds used to buy that property over to us, minus the sales expenses such as transfer taxes and brokerage commissions and even mortgage payoffs as well. These are all considered to be a part of the total value of the property being sold, however. And we'll get into a little bit more about what cash boot and mortgage boot is a little bit later on in the presentation. We can definitely go on to the next slide here. Definitely like to get into the next step here, which is essentially that why you'd want to have a qualified intermediary here is you need to have someone that's a third party and is not considered to be in control of you, the taxpayer. So if you were to say give your funds to your brother, who happens to be let's say a title agent that has a qualified intermediary, he cannot accept these proceeds on your behalf because he's not considered to be a qualified intermediary. He's a disqualified person, meaning he's within some sort of control of you. And this also goes with your attorneys as well. Certain attorney offices, if you've worked with them in the past, you may not be able to use them as a qualified intermediary. They may relatively be in control of you if you've paid them in the past for previous services, or or really it just depends if you're a blood relative or not as well. So you really need a third party, someone that's impartial, that won't be in any sort of control of you, the taxpayer. I'd say really it's not very difficult to find a qualified intermediary that's capable of doing this, but really you have to be sure that you're not going to an attorney you've used in the past and simply having them hold it in their IOLA account. Because even though the IOLA account, technically speaking, isn't your funds, it's your attorney's account, that account is set up specifically for you. These are your proceeds that they are holding in this account specifically on your behalf, and they're not going to go out and spend the money in the IOLA account. And Len, obviously, if you want to jump in here, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add regarding Riverside's, use of these funds and how we obviously hold these funds in a very safe manner. We hold these funds in interest-bearing accounts, very reputable banks. We're not investing these proceeds anywhere. These are staying in a specific account that we allow you to obtain statements on, saying that this money went into this account on this day, and it's still there, and we're still accruing. Obviously, if there's interest involved, then there's going to be interest involved. If not, then there's going to be just a statement shown that this is just in a separate account, untouched by anyone else and unmingled with the operating expenses or operating operating funds of the company as well.
Yeah, that's correct, Zach. I don't think I need to say much more than that. Obviously, we take the utmost caution in securing our clients' funds. We're very, very careful about that. We maintain them in segregated accounts. We have multiple sign-offs before ever dispersing any funds towards replacement properties. You can call us at any time, and we'll, obviously provide you a statement of the accounts. We have a surety bond. So that is obviously, one of the things that people are very concerned about, particularly in this environment today. And it's a phone call that, I'm actually, receiving a lot more often now is, how do I know my funds are secure? What's going to happen? There's a lot of uncertainty in today's market. And so, our goal is to make sure that you guys that are doing exchanges are comfortable in knowing that your funds are secure and safe, that we work with reputable banks that are well-funded, and that we're not going anywhere. We're an affiliate of one of the largest title agents in New York. We handle, between our 1031 company and the title company, we're handling, thousands upon thousands of transactions a year with hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars running through our accounts. We're not going anywhere. We're not a fly-by-night company. And so we're here, and we're here to help you guys particularly through these hard times. So I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
You guys want to take questions or?
Well, I was
Sure.
going to say, yeah, we definitely take some questions. I was going to go into some other regulations regarding QIs. Let's see here. Preferred 1031 clause language. So I think what he's referring to, this anonymous attendee's question, is the language that will be used in contracts of sale to allow for a 1031 exchange to occur. Now, the most important thing in a 1031 exchange is that you have the right to assign this contract and the rights within it to a other party, or in this case, it would be a qualified intermediary. And you'll see a lot of times, whether you actually have this language in your contracts as default language for your sellers when it comes to their investment properties, but you really should have some sort of mention that the seller, or on the case of an acquisition, the buyer has the right to perform a 1031 exchange, and that the other party to the transaction will obviously complete their obligations to allow the exchange to occur at no expense to themselves.
Right.
So what it means is they're going to allow for the assignment of rights in the contract, in the case of the sale, to occur, allowing the seller to assign their rights in the contract over to the qualified intermediary and have them technically convey the property over to the buyer and accept the proceeds on behalf of you, the seller, and then hold those proceeds in a qualified intermediary account. Now, a lot of times you won't see any issues with this on the sale, but really most of the time when it comes to being a little bit more of a problem is on the purchase end of the transaction, because there are contracts that are just, distinctly written that say that the buyer has no right to assign any part of the contract over to a third party. So typically you really want to see this 1031 language that we can provide you. We do have sample language we do provide to our clients saying that as the buyer of this property, we reserve the right to assign this contract over as part of a 1031 exchange, and that the seller will cooperate with this. It's more of a cooperation clause than the right to do a 1031 exchange. And in theory, go ahead, Len. You're gonna say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry, Zach. I was just saying, typically, sellers that restrict the assignment rights in the contract, they're concerned about flips and things of that nature. When you explain to them that this is just so that you can complete your 1031, more often than not, they're willing to comply, and for the specific reason of allowing you to complete your 1031. And like Zach said, we can send you language for that. So, the seller's still secure that you're not flipping it to anyone and that you're still able to complete your 1031.
Yes, I only ran into an issue once, and it was with the Housing and Urban Development, which was that they have very standard contracts. They're very set in their ways. They did not want to alter the language in their contracts whatsoever. And this became a little bit of an issue because our buyer saw that in his contract, there wasn't going to be any sort of assignment allowed. Now, at the end of the day, this whole crisis actually prevented this from becoming more of an issue, as the entire deal had fallen apart at that point. The buyer backed away. They didn't end up going into contract. But it just shows at the end of the day, depending upon the organization you're working with, and if it's especially if it's a government organization or a city organization, that they can be a little bit stubborn and they may not understand certain nuances of a 1031 exchange. But once you get them on the phone with a qualified intermediary like us, or you have you yourself are a little bit more savvy with 1031 exchanges, and you understand that this has no cost to the other party to allow this to occur, then generally speaking, most attorneys and most sellers will allow this language to be added into the contract, or to just remove the no assignment language from their contract. Because in theory, as long as you, the buyer, are allowed to assign the rights in this contract to anyone else, the 1031 exchange can occur. You may not necessarily see the 1031 exchange cooperation language in every single contract, but that doesn't mean that it's not correct, as long as the buyer has that right and it's not explicitly denied within the contract.
And Zach, just to underscore your point, if someone is planning on doing a 1031 and they're thinking of acquiring properties at auction or other governmental properties held by other governmental authorities, it's important to identify this issue and discuss it as early as you can, because I have had it where a client wanted to use 1031 funds, and there was the assignment, the seller, meaning whether it was the auctioneer or the clerk, whoever is deemed as the seller, didn't allow it. They didn't allow the assignment, and we couldn't assign it. So it's definitely something that's important to identify early on if that's your strategy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's see here. Now, let's see. Good question here, which is how long do you have to hold a 1031 exchange? Or sorry, how long do you have to hold a 1031 property before you can sell it and do another 1031 exchange? Now, the golden rule here is to hold it for 2 years, and that way, they're completely safe. But again, you are able to sell it before that and do a 1031 exchange. You're just not going to be in as great of a position to argue that the property was held for qualified use. Basically saying that, if the property you bought, if something happened to it or there was major construction going on around the area and you're simply unable to rent it out, but you show that you've tried to rent it out for, 12 to 16 months or really longer than a year, I'd say is a good opportunity to say like, well, I've been trying to rent it out. I'm unable to rent it out. I really want to, continue owning real property as my investment property, but I'm not getting anything out of this. So you are able to, make the argument that you can swap from this property, which is not making you any sort of money, to a different 1031 property or multiple 1031 properties and diversify your portfolio that way. Now, it's not as ideal as having a tenant in the property for 24 straight months and then selling it after that, but it can be an argument you can make saying, well, I intended to hold it for investment use. It was on the market for rent. I didn't immediately renovate it and throw it on the market for sale. I tried to rent out this apartment and it did not rent for said period of time. And if your CPA agrees that this is a long enough period of time for you to hold the property, attempt to rent it out, and fail to rent it out, then you can do a 1031 exchange. We would just recommend always that you speak to a CPA for their own opinion to see that, well, the facts and circumstances seem fine. You're able to do a 1031 exchange again on this property due to the fact that obviously that you're unable to rent it out or that there's some other issue with the property. You're not getting the rent that you thought you would get, and you're simply swapping over from one investment property to another. Really, that's really the best case scenario in that case. Speak to a CPA, get their opinion. Generally speaking, they will agree. And obviously, when it comes to certain CPAs, we can get on the phone, we can discuss our point of view, but at the end of the day, they're really the ones that you should be listening to in terms of when you can jump back into a 1031. Although it's not exactly incredibly risky to do it before 2 years, it's just something that you would really want to speak to somebody about just to get their opinion on the facts and circumstances at hand.
Yeah, and as Zach said, the most important word he used was intended. You have to look at what the intent was and how do you demonstrate what your intent was. So if you hold a property for 3 months and then you sell it, it may be very difficult to demonstrate that your intent was really to hold this property as investment property. The IRS, upon audit, would look at it and say, you held the property for 3 months, that's a property that's held for sale. So that's why a lot of people look at the amount of time, because that is a very easy way of trying to demonstrate intent. However, there may be other ways to demonstrate that your intent really was to hold the property and something changed, right? Facts and circumstances play a large role in it. So as Zach said, you want to talk to your CPA, you may want to talk to someone like Matt to get his opinion. And of course, we'll always try to help out and formulate the strategy as well with you.
Absolutely. And there's one great scenario I had actually about a year back where a guy had called me. He said, I bought a property 3 months ago and I've been using it for investment use, but this guy came in the door and offered me triple what I had initially paid for it. It wasn't on the market for sale. It was just simply up for rent. He saw how well it was doing and he said, I want to buy this property. And he gave him a crazy deal. It was a deal that it was almost too good to be true. And he called me, he said, well, I didn't hold the property for that long. I've been renting it out. I didn't intend to sell it. It wasn't on the market. And through the conversations with his tax advisors, we determined that, it was in fact possible to attempt to do a 1031 exchange again, because again, the intent was there. There wasn't an argument of whether or not he wanted to sell this property. He didn't know this person prior to entering into a 1031 exchange. He just got this deal that was incredibly good, something that he hadn't intended to get, something that just simply came in out of the blue. And the tax advisors on that deal said that it was completely fine. The 1031 exchange went through and ended up being completely fine at the end of the day. Now, one thing to keep in mind here when it comes to QI's roles is that we can sometimes be a little bit difficult when it comes to getting the funds back, just because we have to follow what's known as the G6 restrictions, saying that the taxpayer that's actually performing the 1031 exchange never can have access to any of these funds, cannot pledge, cannot borrow, or really any sort of control whatsoever over these proceeds while they're being held with the QI. Now, it gets a little bit more difficult territory when you're paying for things like you want to pay for an inspection fee or a survey fee outside of closing. Really shouldn't be doing that. G6 restrictions really prevent you from having any sort of access to these funds. It's like essentially preventing you from using the qualified intermediary as an ATM. You really have to only use this for the acquisition of real property. And the acquisition of real property can be considered to be certain closing costs paid at the closing table, shown on the closing statement, as well as down payments and earnest money deposits on properties you want to actually purchase, so long as you're having an assignment of that rights to actually purchase the property done to the qualified intermediary, then allowing them to send the funds on your behalf. Now, G6 specifically becomes more of an issue when a client has identified, let's say, 3 properties, and the 45-day period has expired. So they're at the end of the 1031 exchange. They're in phase 2, and at that point, you're not able to actually get any of these proceeds back if those properties are no longer up for sale, if they've been purchased by someone else, or in this case, let's just say you didn't identify DST, you identified 3 pieces of real property you wanted to own directly, and all those 3 pieces of property are no longer on the market. You would say, well, the 1031 exchange is over. I can't buy these properties. I literally can't buy them because they were just bought by other people, and those are all closed by now. Can I get my money back? And unfortunately, we have to hold on to these funds for the entire exchange period in order to basically abide by the G6 regulations set by the IRS to be a qualified intermediary. We can only give the funds back if they unidentify everything before the 45th day, in which case they get all their money back on the 46th day of the exchange, or they wait for the 180-day period to expire, in which case they get the funds back on the 181st day of the exchange. And, really best case scenario, I would say, is if the 45-day period has expired, you've only identified 1 or 2 properties, and you've closed on those 1 or 2 properties, but there's a little bit of extra cash left over. Technically speaking, the exchange is over because you've acquired all identified properties, and therefore you're allowed to take whatever's remaining in the exchange account back, because there's nothing else identified. There's nothing else that you can purchase as part of the exchange. So it's another good reason to keep in mind that a DST can be a valuable tool in a 1031 exchange, because if just say, for example, in this case, if you identified 2 pieces of commercial property that you really liked, that you could have poured all the proceeds into either one of those and identified a DST as a backup third option, you would have been able to take that money and basically inject it into a DST as the backup scenario. So no matter what, you would end up with profitable real property without the recognition of capital gains tax on those, what you may have considered to be a failed exchange because you didn't acquire the direct investment you wanted to. You were able to throw those funds into a DST that you chose, that you deemed to be acceptable and deemed to be valuable, and actually avoid paying the capital gains tax. And in which case, in the future, you'd be able to then take those funds out of the DST once it's inevitably sold, and then inject those proceeds back into the real estate market or back into another DST, depending upon how much you enjoy the DST, or if that's something that you may not have considered at first, but then after doing it, you may have considered that, oh, this might be worth to continue more 1031 DSTs and continuing to do it from there. And I'd say, again, G6 is really the toughest thing qualified intermediaries to deal with, because it really is a difficult conversation to have with taxpayers. And that's why the 45-day period is the most important period in the exchange, because everything must be set in stone by midnight on the 45th day. Otherwise, the exchange cannot be altered at all past the 45th day, unless there's a global pandemic, in this case, that the IRS grants relief for, or in the case of Hurricane Sandy, there was a disaster relief as well for that extended deadlines for properties that were negatively affected by the disaster, and for taxpayers that had their closings negatively affected as well. And we can get more into that a little bit later on as well. Now, as I mentioned before, closing costs are considered to be completely fine to pay for with 1031 exchange funds. But there's a couple of them you want to keep an eye out for. Really, the most difficult ones you're going to come across is if there's a lender involved in the transaction, as loan costs are not considered to be directly tied to the acquisition of real property. They're directly tied to the acquisition of the loan to acquire that real property. They're not considered to be a real property expense, which is a little strange in my opinion when it comes to the origination fees and a lot of other things like lender's attorney fees and lender's title insurance, things you should really watch out for. But when it comes your end of the transaction, like the owner's title insurance fees, your attorney fees, your transfer taxes, the mansion tax, whatever. If you're in New York City, it's over $1 million. You know, it's essentially one of those things where you really have to keep an eye on these transactional items. Speak with your QI, make sure that you're not going into the closing and basically unknowingly recognizing tens of thousands of dollars of gain, depending upon the loan charges. It's really one of those things where the top 4 things you'll see, as I mentioned before, title insurance, attorney fees and CPA fees, common closing costs such as the the transfer taxes, and lastly the and the recording fees and things such as that, where it's essentially related to the title fees as well. Lastly, I'd say the more difficult closing transactional items you'll come across are like security deposit credits, things like that that will offset the actual purchase price of the property. If you're selling a property for $1 million and there's a $10,000 security deposit on that property that's going to be transferred over to the new buyer, you would typically see that there's a credit given off the purchase price, so that as opposed to the seller of the property cutting a check for $10,000 and handing it to the buyer and then receiving a $1 million check from the buyer, what they would typically do is just reduce it by $10,000 and get a check for $990,000. Now, in a 1031 exchange, you want to avoid those types of credits just because at the end of the day, you're going to be receiving less cash, and the IRS will consider that cash you did not receive to be considered boot, as you essentially just gave it back to the buyer at that point. So what you'll want to see typically is separate checks cut for any sort of credits that would offset the purchase price and receive the entire sale proceed amount minus the acceptable closing costs, in which case you would have a perfect exchange at that point. There wouldn't be any sort of boot on the credited amounts, whether it's the security deposit or whether it's the prorated rents. You just want to make sure that you pay that separately, or you can obviously speak with your QI and your tax advisors as the best case scenario here. You may have certain things to offset those at the end of the year, but you want to just make sure that everything's clear when you go into the closing and you're not left with a few $1,000s in tax you didn't realize you were going to have. And on these very large commercial properties, those security deposits and rent can be significant. So you definitely want to make sure you speak to your qualified intermediary ahead of the closing to go over any issues that they may see on this transactional item statement. Say the next slide, unless you want to jump in here with any anything that you've seen with the specific transaction items.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it. I think the last thing you said is important. It's a difficult conversation to have often when you tell a client that the prorations are potentially an issue, and the best thing potentially to do, depending of course if you have other offsets, is to bring money to closing so you can pay those outside of closing and not have it really impact your 1031. That's not always so practical, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So it's a tough conversation at times.
Yeah, and again, at the end of the day, depending upon the property, it could just be a few $100s worth. And sometimes they'll just say, well, my accountant will figure it out at the end of the year. I'll pay a small amount of tax on it. It will be what's known as partial exchange, but it's not a failed exchange by any means. It just simply means that you have some taxable liability on this credited amount. And again, it's a conversation QI is like we'll have with the clients. When it comes to commercial property, it's more significant than it is on residential, smaller deals. And again, we're always happy to help in any way we can, let you know the liabilities, but it is your choice at the end of the day to decide whether or not to take that that into consideration. So at the end of the day, as I mentioned before with this slide, you do have 45 days from the closing of your relinquished property to actually identify new properties you'd like to buy. And typically what you'll see in these 1031 exchange transactions, especially with the forward exchanges, is they'll do a 3-property rule stating that, well, I sold my property here in New York City, let's say for $1 million. I'm identifying 3 different properties, all worth $1 million or more. And any one of these properties, if I were to purchase them, I would have a successful exchange. Now, there is another alternative to this, which is if you're going to go from a larger property, let's say the $1 million property in New York, and you want to identify a plethora of properties throughout the country, like in Oklahoma City, down in Florida, in Georgia, North Carolina. It really depends upon where you're comfortable investing. And you can identify as many properties as you'd like, so long as all those properties' values put together doesn't equal to more than double the value of the property that was sold. So if you sell the property in New York for $1 million, double that value is $2 million. Theoretically, you could identify property worth up to $2 million in total, saying that, let's say there's 10 properties worth $200,000 each throughout the country. And at the end of the day, that value is considered to be double the value of the property that was sold, and therefore it's a valid identification. Even though it's over 3 properties, it follows what's known as the 200% rule. And once you go beyond the 200% rule, it gets a little bit messier. Really, you don't want to go into what's known as the 95% rule, basically stating that you need to purchase 95% of the fair market value of identified properties in order for the exchange to be successful. Basically, it means that you over-identified on the 200% rule, or you identified 4 properties on the 3, when you really were trying to use the 3 property rule and didn't know about the 200% rule, and now you're stuck in the 95% rule. You'll very rarely see an exchange take this route, and even more rarely will you see an exchange succeed with the 95% rule, because you essentially have to exponentially increase your wealth by buying every single one of your identified properties. It's incredibly rare, and really typically you'll only see it when exchangers don't know what they're doing with identifications, and they're just simply identifying the phone book in most cases, where they're saying, oh, I identify Jackson County, Georgia, and every property contained within it. And you're like, well, now you have to buy every single property, or 95% of the properties in Jackson County, Georgia. So good luck with that. It's not going to work. Yeah, and I say, really,
Zach, let me step in for a moment. I'll tell you about the most recent example. I used 95%. I used 95% when I had a client who exchanged out of a property, sold for $2 million all cash, and he wanted to buy a $7 million bundle of co-op units. No, they were condos. They were condos in the Parkchester section of the Bronx, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had to lever up to buy those condos. It was separate units. It was a basket of units, all owned by the same owner, but they were dotted throughout about 4 buildings. He didn't own any complete building 100%. He owned a bunch of units in 4 buildings. The problem we ran into was can't use 3 properties, can't use 200% because he went from $2 million to $8 million. So he's got $8 million worth of property scattered across, I swear the basket was like 26 apartments or something. So we had only one choice, 95%. And then we just turned to him and we said, buddy, you better close. So we closed, we used 95%, and that was it. But it's very rare. I mean, as you stated, it's it's 95% typically a safety valve, but at the end of the day, that was an example, to use the language on my own slides, that it was critically necessary. But other than that, you don't want.
Matt, you muted yourself.
I did mute myself, but at the end of the day, I wanted to turn the floor back over to you if you wanted to talk about. I want to go over just coronavirus for a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, let me just. All right, so coronavirus, right? What did the federal?
Matt. Wait, before you do that,
yeah.
I want to read the second code for this class, just for everyone attending. Second code, if you're ready, is the word class, C-L-A-S-S, class, like a classroom, but just class, C-L-A-S-S. Now take it away, Matt. My apologies.
Okay, so let's talk about what they did in terms of relief for the coronavirus based on 1031 exchanges, okay? Because it's a little bit strange the way the IRS went about this. The IRS basically did a very, very global blanket extension of all things that were time sensitive under the Internal Revenue Code. If you had to do it by April 15th, then you instead got extended to July 15th. This is a little bit weird for a couple reasons we're going to go into, right? First thing, as we were mentioning before, natural disasters, or federally declared disasters more specifically, because pandemic is a little bit loose definition of a natural disaster, those are the only exceptions to the 45 and the 180-day rules. Well, we have an exception going on right now. Notice 2020-23, which came out on April 9th, basically said, okay, if I guess it was April 1st, not April 15th. Anything between April 1st and April 15th, deadline now occurs on April 15th, right? Right, here's a problem. If you had an ID that expired between February 29th and March 31st, which was smack in the middle of the pandemic, you're not covered under this notice, or are you, right? 2020-23 makes a reference to Revenue Procedure 2018-58, right? Ignore the numbers for a second, right? Let's just say that the pandemic notice references the regular notice. What does the regular notice say? Well, if you have a federally declared disaster, the 45 days and the 180 days get postponed. Here's the language in the notice right on the slide. Postponed by 120 days or to the last day of the disaster extension authorized by other guidance, whichever is later. But then the same one says, well, unless guidance specifies otherwise. Wow, is that confusing? It's confusing to me. It's confusing to other really prominent tax advisors, and it is confusing to the entire 1031 world. So which is it, right? The IRS has to clarify to us, do we get a 180-day extension? Do we get an extension until the president lifts the disaster declaration? Do we get some other period, meaning it's July 15th and that's it? Are the people who had ID periods and exchange closing periods that expired between the 29th of February and the 31st of March totally out of luck? Stay tuned for the next episode, because right now the IRS is totally overloaded with stimulus payments and other sorts of really important stuff. And they don't have time to go ahead and address every single nuance. So the story is, we're gonna have to find out. We don't really know. So we're all waiting on pins and needles, figuring out how this is gonna work. But in the meantime, if you have specific issues related to COVID-19 on this stuff, you can always email me. But that is what they did.
And Matt, I'm sure like you, I have many frustrated clients who have had periods that expired prior to April 1st. And now they can't do any, more due diligence. They can't get to the property, lender issues, et cetera, et cetera. They're nervous about being able to close, or even if the property is going to be available. And it seems, I hate to use this word because the tax code isn't necessarily fair, but in this case, it doesn't make any sense.
I agree with you. Here's my prediction: 80-20 odds. I would say 80% that you get further guidance with extensions for all those people, and it'll go further than July 15th. 80% odds.
That's great, and that's what I've been telling some of these clients, because they've been very nervous. And I said, listen, guys, I think you should take a deep breath. I understand your concerns. I get it, but and there's nothing you can do right now. But I tell them, just wait. I think you think that there'll be something more coming. So that's great that you are fairly confident about that.
I am fairly confident. I can't predict the future, but I'm fairly confident. So we will see if that gets vindicated. Do you guys want to pick it up on substantially the same property as identified, or because I'm all right out. So.
Yeah, so substantially the same property identified, just simply meaning that if you identify one Main Street and you end up buying 2 Main Street, it's not substantially the same. Now, specifically when it comes to New York City, it can get a little bit more tricky because you have to have unit numbers as well if you're just buying a specific condo unit or co-op unit. And, if it's formally known as this, or it's just known as, let's just say, the Madison Square apartment complex, and you want to buy the entire thing, you don't have to identify every single unit within that complex. You can just list the name of that and the street address and purchase the actual apartment complex and consider it to be substantially the same as what you identified. On a similar topic, they actually identified, I suppose the IRS released guidance as part of the Treasury regulations, I guess known as subsection K now, where it's actually, you have to identify 75% or more of the value of the property that you end up acquiring. So if you identify a property as a 1 acre lot with these tax lot numbers and it's worth $1 million, if you only end up buying, a property that property for $750,000, then theoretically it's substantially the same. It gets a little bit trickier when the property is worth more and it's within 75% of the value. It's not really ruled on. I wouldn't say I would be comfortable saying that it's substantially the same if it's greater. But most of the time, you would say, yeah, it's fine as long as you, the taxpayer, are comfortable, and your tax advisors would agree that it can be considered substantially the same at that point. But really, on paper, you'd really want it to be lower. If you're gonna identify a property, you want to go on the higher end of the spectrum of what you'd be paying for it, and then if you're able to negotiate it down slightly, that's still fine. It's still substantially the same at the end of the day. It gets a little bit more difficult if you're identifying a property as, let's just say, 1 Main Street, and you end up buying the land and the house itself under separate contracts, it's a little bit more confusing on that end. And from my perspective, Matt, if I'm not mistaken, if you identify one property and end up purchasing two properties that are essentially that property, is it considered to be the same? I don't believe it is, from what I've seen at least. But I'm not sure if you have a perspective on if you were to identify, let's just say, one country road, and you end up buying the farmhouse and the land under two separate contracts. I believe that would be considered substantially different. But again, that's just what my interpretation was on the regulations.
Yeah, the regulations effectively say the other thing about it is, there's a difference between buying a 75% stake in the farm and the land versus identifying the farm and the land, but only buying the farm or only buying the land. I wouldn't get too deep into it generally. I would just say the identification is usually the trickiest part of everything, both from the perspective of finding something and then putting the right ID down. And you have to work closely with QI and then, if necessary, tax counsel to sort that out. And I'm gonna roll the next slide here just to make sure that we can get through the essentials before we run out of time.
Sure. Oh wait, one last thing, which is if I just don't mind, the Delaware Statutory Trusts. It's a good thing to bring up that you must identify each property contained within these Delaware Statutory Trusts if they're not single property trusts. There are such things as portfolio Delaware Statutory Trusts, which have multiple properties, like healthcare portfolios, things such as that. And you really have to make sure you identify every single property. So if it's a large portfolio DST, you want to make sure that you're not using the 3-property rule, but you're using the 200% rule. That way you're 100% certain that the property is properly identified, even though it may, only be $1 million. If it's 5 properties that in total is worth $1 million investment, then you have to make sure you identify 5 properties and do it as specific as possible. And obviously, we're here to help, and your DST reps or your other financial advisors are obviously there to help as well.
Zach,
go ahead, Matt.
Just to chime in on that, we absolutely provide that service for our clients and investors and make sure that they fill out their identification form correctly, because Zach's entirely right. It becomes very complex when you're dealing with Delaware Statutory Trusts. You have to name the DST. You have to name the address of the DST, the percentage ownership of the DST, and you also have to take into account, when you're using the 200% rule, the amount of debt on the DST. Going back to the 95% rule, often we actually have come across the use of the 95% rule because clients that are going to do a big exchange that sell their building with no debt on it, but then we diversify them into a portfolio of DSTs with leverage over 50%. Now we're very confident we're going to be able to close them on every single DST. So we don't have that fear of other people using the 95% rule where they have to close on nearly 100% of all of the properties they identify. So we feel very confident we're going to close on 100% of them, but it still has to be listed correctly. So we take that burden off the client and your lap to make sure that we're getting it over to Riverside filled out accurately. Thanks, Zach.
So, Zach, Matt, we have a couple minutes left here. I think, Matt, you wanted to kind of take it to the finish line here, and so we don't keep people much longer.
I think he's just having a mic issue.
Oh.
While we're waiting for Matt to chime in, I wanted to touch on another product line within the Delaware Statutory Trust that would be relevant for investors that need a liquidity option for either the settlement of an estate and or they're just elderly. We have Delaware Statutory Trusts that are pulled up into 721 up REITs, and therefore you invest in the Delaware Statutory Trust property that covers your 1031 exchange. Later on in time, that property is pulled up into a REIT, and in exchange for your DST percentage ownership, you receive operating units of REIT shares. So this way, if there is a death or a pass over of the assets to the beneficiaries and they get a step up in basis, the heirs or beneficiaries are able to liquidate those shares of the REIT more readily than trying to put their interests of DSTs up for sale and creating a liquidity event there. So very good, very powerful estate planning tool. Generally, I reserve those for elderly clients or clients that are sick and know that they're going to have some sort of step up in basis, and or just extremely conservative investors that want the diversification of a REIT behind their DST and never plan or want to do another 1031 exchange in the future. So it ultimately allows for the tax deferral and the pull up for continuous deferral and the step up in basis with a tremendous amount of diversification and a more liquid option than a straight DST investment. That's it. I think Matt's got his mute button off now.
Yep.
Matt, there?
Right, so I had to unmute my phone. So my computer mic ran out, my wireless mic ran out of battery in the middle of it, so I called in instead. All right then, so we should take it home with a discussion of the 180-day time limit, and then really briefly touch on the two matters in which I, as tax counsel, get brought in most often. So 180 days, you have to close anything that you close on outside of the 180-day window is not going to count. So even if you close on the property, if it's outside the 180-day window, it's still boot, which is a terrible outcome because you have a tax liability, but you're still illiquid. As far as the deadline, we mentioned it's not flexible, but coronavirus notice extended it. So if you had any 180-day deadline that was not scheduled to expire, or rather was scheduled to expire between April 1st and July 15th, it expires on July 15th per the notice, and then depending on your interpretation, might expire after that. Once the exchange is over, the intermediary transfers boot and all of the like-kind property that's left over back over to the taxpayer. Boot is taxable. But at the end of the day, the QI cannot transfer any of these funds. We went over G6 restrictions and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. Okay. Boot netting. The reason why people love 1031 so much, more than even the reinvestment aspect, is the idea that you can kick the can down the road on debt, right? Many of you may be familiar with the idea of negative capital or debt in excess of basis or phantom income, right? This problem occurs when you have had a property you've owned for a long time and depreciated down to nothing, and or did a cash out refinance. And I always tell people who are doing tax projections when they have a highly leveraged property, right? I just did this yesterday. I was on the phone with a gentleman and a broker from a real estate outfit, and he had a $14 million property with a $9 million cash out refinance on it, and his tax basis was zero. So he started running the numbers, and he was like, why do I get taxed on $14 million a gain when I'm paying 9 of it back to the bank? I said, sir, did you cash out refinance that $9 million? Yes, I did. Okay, and how much cash did you put in your pocket at closing? $7.5 million. What'd you pay in taxes on that? Nothing. Okay, well, sir, now the bill is due. Oh, right. So to solve these problems, right, the tax code and the regulations very generously allow you to take the $14 million at closing, pay 9 to the bank, and put 5 with Zach and Len at Riverside, and then buy a $14 million property with $9 million in new leverage, and you defer tax on the entire $14 million. That is boot netting, okay? And it is a really nifty feature of 1031s, and the reason why people really love 1031s is because they get to kick the can down the road on negative capital or negative basis, which is a term that is technically incorrect, but I roll with it when I need to. You can kick the can down the road infinitely, even if you have leverage on the property and you've done a cash out refinance. Here's the restriction on this, okay? What you can't do is you can't put new leverage on the property when you buy it as part of a 1031. Let me give you an example, okay? Instead of having $14 million with $9 million of debt, let's talk about $14 million free and clear, okay? No debt at all. You take $14 million, you put it in with Zach and Len, and then you turn around and say, well, I know I need to buy $14 million of property, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out a $9 million loan. I'm going to use $5 million to buy the property. I'm going to take the other $9 million in my pocket, and voila, take a look at that, right? I did a valid exchange. I did $14 million for $14 million. And at the same time, I got a nice little bonus out of it that's tax-free, right? And the answer is wrong, because any cash that comes to you at the closing table in a 1031 exchange is always boot. So you cannot cash out refinance as part of the exchange. But the key word is part of the exchange, okay? And this is the number one most frequent question that I get. And then I'm going to finish off this presentation with the number two most frequent question I get. Number one is, Matthew, when can I refinance? And the answer is, under the law, I put the two operative cases on this slide, Fredericks and Garcia. Both of them are favorable to the taxpayer. But here's the thing. Garcia and the PLR that is mentioned at the bottom of Garcia stand for the idea that when you're on the sell side and you're taking your relinquished property and you're putting more debt on it in order to line up your boot netting and maybe put some cash in your pocket, you have to make sure that the reason why you're refinancing in close proximity to selling is for a business purpose and not just to put money in your pocket. So it's a little bit more restrictive refinancing right before you sell. Where it's less restrictive is refinancing after you buy. That is Fredericks. When you buy your replacement property, the old nanosecond or the magic pen rule would dictate that 1 nanosecond after you close, right? So you could sign all your documents for closing, pick up your pen, and then sign the documents for your refinance. That is the way the law reads. Good luck explaining that to New York State. I have 3 audits going at the moment of New York State saying that refinances that occurred in close proximity to sale or purchase were boot. They are wrong, but it's really annoying going through the audit process and trying to convince them of that. So you have to be careful with this. The safest thing you could do is wait a year on either side of the transaction, but I have even seen New York State challenge periods of more than a year because they're insane. But the law is the law, and in my mind, the law is clear. I think in the IRS's mind, the law is clear because the IRS is not really auditing for this. It's really New York State, and I don't know what New York State is even doing. Let me finish off by going to the very last, or the second thing that I run into all the time, and that is dropping and swapping, okay? The thing about the statute, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act said you must sell real estate and buy real estate in a 1031 exchange. No other property is eligible. That includes partnership interest and stock in a corporation. So if you have me, Zach, and Jeff Kiesnoski in an LLC, and we are all selling our property and we have differing goals about 1031s and cashing out and that sort of thing, if we sell inside of the LLC, we all got to do the same thing. Me, Zach, Jeff, we all have to agree. Now, in very frequent scenarios, more often than not, we don't agree. Zach says, I want to go cash out. I want to take my property. I want to go cash out and I want to go buy stock, or I want to cash out. I want to go buy a Ferrari. Jeff says, I want a 1031 into a DST. And I say, I want a 1031 into a brick and mortar property of my own that I'm managing myself. What do? Well, we have to drop and we have to swap. 2 stages. 1, you have to liquidate your LLC. For any tax partnership, this will apply. LLCs, LPs, that sort of thing. Drop out and then take back tenant and common interests, which anybody who's listening who's a real estate attorney understands. TIC interests, you would never do them except for tax reasons. TICs are terrible. As my old professor, Stefan Tucker at Georgetown used to say, I hate TICs, they give you Lyme disease, okay? However, TICs are usable in the 1031 context because each TIC interest is its own piece of real property, separate from the others. So if me, Zach, and Jeff own in the LLC, we all have to do the same thing. If we own as TICs, we get to do whatever we want. Zach takes his cash, buys his Ferrari. He owes his own tax liability on his cash. Jeff opens an account with Len Berkowitz and says, I'm going to go 1031 into my DST all on my own, and I'm going to own it myself. I go ahead and I put my account with, with Len, and I say, okay, I'm going to go into the property that I'm looking at, and I'm going to own it myself, and everybody's happy. The thing being, however, that conversions to TIC are tricky and that you have to observe the formalities. The formalities are in this revenue procedure I put here. True TICs for tax purposes not only have to be TICs by deed, but you also have to follow all these formalities on this list. You have to give all of your different tax items and cash items proportionate among each TIC based on percentage ownership. And there's a bunch of other stuff that you can't do. The other one that's pretty sticky besides pro rata division of tax and cash items is restrictions on transfer. People don't like the idea that you can't put restrictions on transfer in a tax qualified TIC, but it's the truth, you can't do it. So TIC conversions are the other one where you need tax counsel for it by a long shot. And the last thing I'll leave off with is people often say, I heard that you have to hold your TICs for 2 years prior to exchanging. That is not the truth. If you go through proper formalities, you can even do this at the closing table. I've done it before, I've defended it before, and I will be happy to defend it again, but you need to do everything right. So, so I think that's a nice place to leave off. The slide deck has some other useful material in it, and Len and Zach are going to go ahead and distribute that around for everybody who wants it. And I'll leave off with this. If you guys want to send me an email, or you want to go ahead and run any of this by me, or if you've got anybody who you think needs my help, feel free to send an email. We do, in our tax department, we're doing planning and compliance for 1031s, OZs. We're doing it for, Section 1202 small business stock mostly for tech companies. We're doing private equity structuring and tax provisions of agreements and anything else that you could basically think of, except for tax credits and tax grievances, both of which we don't do. But we have referrals for that if you want to hit us up for it. And thanks, everybody, for bearing with us as we went a couple minutes over. But we hope you found it informative. Stay safe and healthy out there. And let me turn the floor back over to the Riverside Mensches to finish the program for the day.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Always appreciate it. Well, everyone, I hope that you found this all very informative. Obviously, if you have any questions afterwards, you can feel free to give us a call. We'll be circulating the materials as well as some additional materials just for your review. And obviously, always happy to take a call any day, time, weekends, if you want. It's fine. And obviously, Len and I are here to help. And Jeff and Dan, pleasure as always to work with you guys.
Thank you, Zach.
And I'm sure we'll be in touch later on today, to be quite honest.
If anybody didn't catch it, if you go to 1031dst.com, fill out a short informational sign-on registration. We'll have your contact details, and you'll have ours, and any questions that come up in the future. Appreciate you all considering using us and offering us, and hopefully we can create some value for you and your clients as well. So thank you guys, and thank you to Zach, Len, Matt, and Jeff.
All right. Thanks, all. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Oh, and for everyone just asking about the CLE form, we'll be emailing that shortly after the class. So you'll be able to get your credits. Just simply fill out the form that we provide in the follow-up email after this class ends. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to give us a call. Have a great day.